Today, yeah, we're talking about portraiture and two really important portrait artists, Rembrandt van Rijn and Chuck Close. We're going to start with Rembrandt. Now let me first say about Rembrandt, he's such a versatile artist that you might, if you keep coming to these lectures, you might be hearing about Rembrandt in other categories as well, because he did many significant things, and he did this at a time in Dutch art where artists were supposed to specialize. You were a landscape artist or a portrait artist or some other category, and he went through all of those categories. So he'll appear over and over again. Today we're going to talk about him as a portrait artist. He grew up in a wealthy home, very distinctive educational background. He was much more liberally educated than most artists were of his era. As you see there, he was Dutch. He fits in the category that we call Baroque, and he's had several teachers and became a master himself at a relatively young age. He had an interesting personality. He was probably one of the most gifted artists we've ever had in the West. He had an interesting personality, though. He had what I would call an acquisitive trait. By that I mean he just kept buying things. He just saw something fascinating, he'd buy it. A lot of people, his whole life, he was almost bankrupt because he made a lot of money. He was a very popular artist most of his life. At the end, things petered out a little bit. But it's an odd trait. Someone as intelligent as that can't seem to manage the most obvious math associated with finance. If you know, you're probably not aware of the fact that one of our great American fathers had the same tendency. Thomas Jefferson was broke his whole life. He just couldn't resist buying things. He constantly remodeled his house, built a room, looked at it, didn't like it, tore it down, redid it. So Monticello has had I don't know how many transformations. Any case, Rembrandt had that same tendency. So he died bankrupt. And we're going to be looking at his self-portraits today, partly because at the end he had fewer customers. One of the last great commissions he had was for the Amsterdam Town Hall. It was a huge painting. It was about 20 feet across and 15 feet high. And when he did group portraits, he tended to create unusual compositions that were not always in the conventional mode. So he, at the very end of his life, he got this big commission, finally sent it over to the town hall, and the town's mayors didn't like it. So a week later, it was back in his studio. The painting still exists today in one of the major museums, but it was such a huge thing that they finally cut it down, and so now it's about 7 feet wide and about 4 feet high. But that was one of his last really big commissions. But throughout his life, he did self-portraits. And so we're going to look at this whole sequence of portraits. And then after we finish him, we're going to be looking at an American artist, Chuck Close, who did a very distinctive set of portraits in a very unusual sort of technique. One other thing I want to say about Rembrandt. He was a profoundly faithful person. I think he was Dutch Reformed. His mother was Catholic, his father was Dutch Reformed. Living in Amsterdam, I'm pretty sure he was Dutch Reformed as well. He's one of our great, really great religious artists. And he somehow has the ability to create a kind of warm atmosphere in his paintings. He inherited the use of dark and light from a famous Italian artist of the Baroque era. And his name was Caravaggio. Caravaggio did very dramatic black and bright lights, and it's a kind of icy, hard light. Rembrandt took that same light and softened it up. And in Rembrandt, you will see a soft, warm light that's really a metaphor for affection. You get a sense that he liked, even loved, most of the people he painted. There's a kind of warmth and a naturalness about it. But that affection did not cause him to idealize people. Because he had a profound Christian faith, he knew none of us were perfect. And he felt there was nothing to be ashamed about by our warts and moles and bald spots and whatever. And so you will see in his self-portraits a kind of frankness. There is no glamorization at all. Okay, let's take a look at the first one. This is Rembrandt as a successful young man. And look carefully at the measurements below this painting in 1628. It's a little bitty thing. It's 8 inches by 6 inches. As you can see, he's a happy man, but he's not the most handsome man. And he's very frank about that. He doesn't glamorize anything. But as you can see, even imagine this at that scale, he's very flashy with his brushwork. He's not fussy about details quite the way most Dutch artists of his generation were. He's what we sometimes call a painterly painter. His medium, of course, is oil, and a painterly painter uses that medium in a thick, textural way. Most of you are familiar with the work of Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh was the same kind of painter. In fact, he put the paint on the canvas sometimes with a trowel and sometimes with his fingers. Anyway, this is Rembrandt as a young man, and as you can see, he's happy, and he sort of exudes a kind of success. At this point, the light in his painting is not quite as warm as we'll see it later on. And notice the background is just a light ground. Typically has a dark figure like this on a light ground. Can we see the next one, please, Emma? Thank you. Saska was his wife. She also came from a very affluent background, and she inherited a lot of money, and he spent through most of that. Eventually, most of that money got put in Titus's account. In a moment, you'll see Titus. Titus was their only son. They had 3 they had 4 children. The first 3 only lasted a week or 2 each. Titus, the 4th one, was the only survivor. Flora is the goddess of flowers. And so Rembrandt liked to dress his figures up in elaborate costumes. That's one of the ways he wasted all his money. He bought all of these costumes. And by the way, he bought tons of art. He knew about Caravaggio's work because he had Caravaggio's work. He spent a fortune on other artists' work. Any case, here's Saskia. As you can see, she isn't glamorized either, even though she's represented here as a goddess of flowers. And you see the focus in a Rembrandt tends to be soft. That's a kind of that sort of means that the light is sort of caressing the figure rather than banging into a sharp edge. And so his figures have substance, but they have a kind of floating substance. And of course he uses the shadows to create this enveloping space. Can we see the next one? This is his son Titus as a monk, again, costumes. You notice it's relatively small, 31 by 26. And most of Rembrandt's paintings, compared to Chuck Close, we'll see later, are going to be relatively small, pretty much life-size, the portraits themselves. This is his son Titus. As you can see, this really deep, dark space, given the fact that he's dressed up like a monk, I think that's some kind of a symbolic reference. And then you get the face itself highlighted, and that's a typical pattern that shows up in all of his portraits. But you have to get close to a Rembrandt to really get it. By the way, we have, I think I've seen just one downtown, and there's another one at the downtown, I mean the Cincinnati Art Museum, and then there's another one at the Taft Museum. So we have 2 in town, but you have to get close to them to really understand what I'm saying about the paint. Now this is, by the way, he painted probably as many as 50 self-portraits. At one point, and by the way, we had at one point almost 500, what we thought was 500 Rembrandt paintings. More careful scholarship started to discern the fact that he, as I say, he was successful. He ran a studio, and he would have his assistants copy his own paintings, even his self-portraits. So at one point, the world was full of Rembrandts. It's more like 300 Rembrandts nowadays, and 30 self-portraits. This is relatively late in his life, and he's dressing himself in, again, a fancy costume, and it has a kind of imperial quality about it. He has this cane or staff that he's holding in the one hand, and I think on this one you can begin to see how he builds his brushwork on the sleeve here with really bold strokes. I've been close to this painting, and the paint's in some places almost a quarter of an inch thick. You can see it's a standard format that he uses with deep shadows and the face highlighted, but also partly in shadow. That's part of his understanding of the human condition, that we're all into ourselves. We're all a mystery. And so when you see a Rembrandt portrait, you feel like you get to know the person, but there's also something there that you don't quite yet know. And in this case, you see he's staring out at us in this seated pose with his fancy costume on. And as I say, it has a kind of firm, almost imperial look about it compared to some of the other late self-portraits. You can see now this one is beyond the other in time. You can see, looking at the scale in inches there, 45 by 37, most of these portraits are about life size. No one has ever explained to me very adequately what the circles in the background are about. Somehow I think, given the fact that they're geometric figures, they highlight the painterliness of the self-portrait. You see, again, he's not shy about representing his age. He's holding his brushes in his hand, and that area is totally obscured, and again, the brushwork is very, very fluid in that area. But you can see he stares out at us. He's trying to connect with us as a fellow human being. Again, ermine cape over his shoulder. I'm sure he didn't paint with an ermine cape over his shoulder. But somehow that mysterious background creates a little more mystery in this self-portrait. And can we see with the next one, please, Emma? He died in 69, and this is one of his very last self-portraits. And you can see again the same technique, the same general approach, the same painterly approach, highlighting the face. In this case, whatever he's wearing is almost totally obscured. And again, there's no self-flattery at all here. Now this is a man, remember he painted this the year he died. He's in total bankruptcy at this point. He bought these big extravagant houses, by the way, had these giant mortgages, and then couldn't pay the mortgage. And at this point, he's finally faced up to reality, and he's got a smaller place. And so he's come to terms with who he is, with his own humanity, his own limitations. But there isn't any sense when you see the frankness of this image that he feels bad about his life. He's sitting there looking at us, confident of who he is and what he is, and he's come to terms with it. And I think that's the last Rembrandt. Now we're going to move on to Chuck Close. Chuck Close is an American painter. You see, he didn't live a very long life. He was from the Midwest. Eventually took a painting course at Yale. And by the way, he was part of a whole generation of really important American artists who went to Yale in the 70s. or in the late 60s and early 70s. There were, I can name about 10 or 15 of them that were really important shapers of American visual arts. They all ended up in New York, and of course, if you want to be famous today as an artist, you've got to go to New York. You've got to be painting in New York. If you're painting Des Moines, Iowa, you can be Rembrandt. No one will ever know who you are. You've got to be in a place like New York or Paris or London. So anyway, he goes to New York, and while he was at Yale, he was noted at being a very flashy, painterly painter, like Rembrandt. Very loose brushwork, very adept, very skillful with the brush. When he went to New York, he started to change. Now, those of you who were a couple weeks ago with that lecture we did back then on Jackson Pollock are probably aware of the fact that abstract expressionism, which was a dominant style in America in the 1950s, Jackson Pollock perhaps most represents that style, was a totally abstract style. That's why it gets that name. What tends to happen in the visual arts? Nowadays, modern communication makes art styles grow up and die much quicker than they did 100, 200 years ago. So a style might be dominant in the media all over the place for 10 years or so, and then there's a reaction to that kind of saturation. And you move in an opposite direction. Well, abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock was one of many artists, and it was in the media all over. He was even on a cover of Life magazine at one point. Eventually, a younger generation of artists said, well, that's fine, but what can I contribute? What can I add to this picture? And newer movements started. Pop art was one of the most current one that dealt with subject matter all of a sudden. At some point, we're going to be looking at the work of Roy Lichtenstein. He did pop subject matter, and basically using romance magazines and newspaper cartoons and so on as the subject matter. But subject matter and narrative and story all of a sudden became important again as a reaction to this abstract quality in abstract expressionism. Well, a couple of those movements moved on, and eventually you get to a style we call photorealism. Photorealism is basically paintings that are done from photographs. Now, when I was an art student and when I taught drawing throughout my career, I almost always had my students draw directly in class from still lifes or models. As part of my generation, it was not thought of as being the best way to get the most energy in your work by copying another work. So someone else did a work of art, that was a photograph. Now you're coming after them and you're basing your art on theirs. So for my generation, it was thought of as kind of cheating, kind of copying. So when I taught drawing, most of my drawing students drew directly from still life or directly from the model, and quite commonly it was rare in my classes for us to spend an entire class period. Drawing class periods range between 2 and 3 hours. it was rare for a student to only work on one drawing. Often we worked with much more spontaneously to try to get a kind of visual energy and a kind of inventiveness in the drawing process rather than just copying. I had to teach students how to technically draw accurately with things like linear perspective, and in fact in my figure classes I had them learn all the surface anatomy, all the bone structure, all the surface anatomy, and they had to pass an anatomy tests in my figure drawing class. But the class itself emphasized a kind of spontaneous approach. All of a sudden, photorealism comes along and becomes a way of using the photograph as a way of catching things that moves too quickly to ever be directly drawn. One of the most prominent photorealists that we're going to be talking about probably in the spring did New York cityscapes, where everything, the buses are going by, the reflections of the windows are changing, and there's no way you could paint this at that locale. We're going to be contrasting that particular artist with an artist you probably heard of, Andrew Wyeth. So I'm going to play city against country. Wyeth is a rural artist, and Estes is the urban artist. Any case, photorealism came on the scene, and artists no longer thought it was a bad deal to work from a photograph. And Chuck Close was one of the pioneers of photorealism. Now here he is, standing next to his self-portrait as a relatively young man. And notice the size of that portrait. 9 foot by 7 foot. They're almost always huge like that. Now let me mention to you an interesting anomaly that might partly explain why all these portraits are just of the head. I am not familiar with him doing any full body portraits of anybody, just of the head, and as large as they are. He had an unusual brain condition that's called face blind. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. He could not recognize people's faces. It's a brilliant guy, gifted painter, but he had this unusual quality called face blind. Something in the brain, some switch didn't connect to an identity with a person. So you begin to wonder, did he make him these big to try to finally be able to recognize them, or what's going on? And you try to figure this out. If you're face blind, what do you see when you look in the mirror? It's a kind of bizarre conception. But anyway, this is one of his very early self-portraits, and it obviously is based on a photograph. And let me mention to you that Jana has a disc on Chuck Close that she's willing to loan out. I've looked at it. It's a wonderful disc. It not only shows Chuck Close, but the whole generation of artists that he was associated with that went to Yale. In any case, what he basically is doing is getting a photograph of himself, and I've seen the photographs, they show up in this disc. They're basically 2 foot by 2 foot, very accurate photographs. He's taking the images of himself. Later on, he has health problems, and other people have to do this for him, and I'll explain that in a few moments. But in any case, so the image is about 2 feet by 2 feet. The next thing he does is place a grid over that image, vertical lines, horizontal lines, so he breaks it into small little units. And then to paint the portrait, he simply fills in those little squares. They're quite small, and given the scale of these portraits, you have to get close to this image to even see the squares that he used. At this point, he's working off his understanding of offset printing, offset lithography. I've done actually offset lithography. It's a way of printing images, taking photographs, and then printing them in magazines or wherever. It's based on what is called color separation. And it's interesting, this is a monochromatic image. He's simply working with values in this image rather colors. But typically, if you get a reproduced image back in the 60s and 70s, it's done in offset lithography. And basically what you do is you photograph a colored subject, whatever it is you want to reproduce, and you do what is called color separation. In other words, there's a filter you put on the camera that picks up all the blues. Then there's another filter that you photograph it again, picks up all the yellows. And each one of these is a separate aluminum printed plate. That image gets photographed on a light-sensitive aluminum plate. So you have a plate for blue. Now you've got a plate for yellow, and then you have a plate for red. And with those three primary colors, you can get most of an image. But the really high quality printing is 4-color printing. They add black to that mix. My younger brother actually ran a color separation studio in Denver, Colorado. And he did very high resolution images for medical texts and things like that. Well, my younger brother is retired now. He's not that much younger than me. And the last part of his career, he didn't do that because the computer all of a sudden took over that process. And so color separation, don't ask me exactly how it's done with a computer nowadays, other than I know that the screen is broken into a zillion different things. In the old days, when my brother did it, it was circular dots. They were called Ben-Day dots. If you see a Roy Lichtenstein painting who's reproducing these comic strips and so on, he actually shows the dots. You translate it to computer, and now what do we call those division pixels, I think. And anyway, you can see it's a dead accurate image of the guy. You can see him standing next to it, so you can see, compare the two. And it's this giant self-image. But notice, it's exactly like him. You don't see any interpretation except the interpretation that might have been in the initial photograph. And you're going to have to face up to that with each of these images I'm going to show you. He doesn't interpret the subject the way Rembrandt did. Rembrandt, when you see his painting, you see that person's filtered through Rembrandt's sensibility. Now somehow the camera becomes the eye for the artist in a strange way. And it creates a separation between us and the person. So the irony of photorealist art is it's realistic as art has ever been throughout the entire history of painting. And yet there's an emotional separation between you and what's represented. And it's partly that intermediate photographic image that's the starting point. Now, can we see the next one, please? Notice the scale again, 8 feet by 7.5 feet. This image of John is, again, I think this became quite a famous image. Chuck Close's painting sold for quite a bit of money by his mid-career, and this painting sold at Sotheby's for a really significant sum. Mentioning money in terms of art is such a waste of time because, you know, I've shown you works, 2 weeks ago I showed you a work that sold for $186 million. Now the material, the physical material in that work probably cost $75 or $80. And the painting sold for $186 million. This painting was, again, one of those very high-priced paintings. I want you to notice something about this, and you can start to understand what I'm talking about in reference to photorealism. Notice how he gives us a really sharp focus on John's eyes. Look at the beard, and especially look at his shoulders. He's wearing some sort of what appears to be a knitted sweater or something. And notice how he's representing the depth of field that's part of, those of you who know photography, there's a depth of field quality in photographic images. Things up close to you get sharp in focus. As they move away from you, you lose focus. Depth of field indicates how deep there's a sharp focus in an image. In this case, you see he replicates that photographic depth of field. Even fuzzier than that is John's hair. You see it mostly off to the side. By the way, he only paints people he knows well. Most of these people are fellow artists or close friends of his, and there's an irony in that. It's a style of painting that's so accurate that there's no sense of an artist's interpretation at all. And then you ask yourself, why'd you choose someone you like then? Don't you want to show you like them in some way, like Rembrandt does? There's an odd, peculiar sort of modern emotional distance in these works. It's almost like we're afraid to reveal how we feel about someone. Can we see the next one, please? Both the image of John and the image of Mark are done in this layered quality that I referred to earlier of the little Ben-Day dots. And again, you see, notice the scale. Mark is not represented quite as large, but you can see Mark in relationship to the audience here, and you see a close-up of Mark's eye. And again, it's done with little minute dots of paint that represent the color areas. And again, probably with just the four-color approach that is typical from offset lithography. Can we see the next one, please? As you can see, this is a later image. Now, this is Lucas Samsaris, who is actually a relatively famous artist in his own right. At this point, he's moved to pixel type images. And if you look at this, you can see a grid in it. And in fact, he's not trying to hide that grid anymore. He's letting us see it. But again, it's that same kind of straight-on look. This is exactly what this person looks like. Typically, his subjects are artists, so they all have this kind of intense look about them. That's the way most of us artists look at the world. So that's who they are. Anyway, this guy was an experimental artist, did all kinds of wild constructions and so on. He was part of that Yale generation. Can we see the next one, please? This is a much later Chuck Close self-portrait. Now I need to explain something to you, and this is why I'm recommending to you to borrow that video from Jana when she gets back. Intervening from the first portraits I showed you, he's had a terrible stroke. In his late 40s, he was hospitalized for like half a year or so, and could hardly move. In the video, you see him now in an electric wheelchair, and he's a right-handed person, and his right arm, he can move the arm, but he can't move his fingers. So he wears a kind of glove, and the brush is stuck into this glove. And when he starts to paint, he has to paint with his whole arm. He can't paint with his finger, so he can't do details much anymore. Another curious thing is he makes these giant paintings still. You see, look at the scale on this one. But how are you going to do that if you're sitting in a wheelchair? So by now, he's a rich man. He's got his own studio, and it's a 2-story studio. He's on the 2nd story, and the floors come together, but before they get to the wall, he leaves about an 8-inch gap there. And so he has this giant painting, and it's hung, and there's a machine up in the ceiling with a motor, and so he can move this painting up and down through the wall, through the floor, because he can't sit any higher than 3.5 feet or so. So the painting, he moves it up and down while he can get close to it with his wheelchair, and then paints in each of the grids. But the technique is still the same. Starts with a self-portrait that's about 2 feet by 2 feet. Now he has to have assistants break that into grids and into pixels to finally give him a format in which to work. And then what he has to do is replicate the color of what he's seeing and the value of what value means dark and light of what he's seeing. And in order to do that, it's difficult for him to do a lot of paint mixing and so on now, given his limitations. He creates what he calls a kind of visual tone. Those of you who are familiar with music know that a tone is made of individual notes that blend together to make a certain kind of sound. What he does to create a certain color area in the painting is he puts several colors down. He typically just moves his whole arm in a kind of swirly pattern. He's got all of his brushes and all of his paints right next to his chair. And then he puts them down. He decides which colors he needs to put in this particular pixel, because the eye, when it stands back, blends those colors, and they're seen as one color, like a tone is seen as one sound, although it's got individual notes in it. These are visual tones that he creates with individual colors, and you can see basically creates this loopy kind of image there, and then puts other colors inside of it, and if you get far enough away from it, it blends together. You get a block away from this thing, it looks like an accurate image. It's actually the same thing. Those of you who are familiar with Impressionism, it's the same approach that is usually associated with Impressionism. Anyway, this is one of his last self-portraits. He died, he had final strokes, and he finally died as a very young man. And this is his tombstone. And this was his very last self-portrait. He did himself with this yellow raincoat on. Now, this is actually ceramic tiles. Obviously, paint wouldn't hold up in this kind of situation. So these are glazed ceramic tiles that replicate that portrait. And again, you can see each individual square tile. And so this becomes his final sort of legacy to us, him staring out at us. And you'll notice he really hasn't interpreted himself very much the way Rembrandt interpreted himself. He just gives us, this is the way I looked, folks. But there's a kind of objectivity about that. There's a kind of integrity about that. It's hard to, you can be critical of it because it's photographic based and so on. But there's a quality of commitment, almost an obsession here. Remember, I started this lecture off mentioning about the fact that he was face blind. And I wondered, what did he see when he looked in the mirror? Did he recognize himself? It was almost, this is an entire attempt to recognize the world he most cares about. He only paints his friends, he only paints himself. He painted his granddaughter up. One of his most problematic paintings, I might add, was of his mother-in-law. But, son-in-laws and mother-in-laws don't always get along all that well. But in any case, be that as it may, there's something, I think, emphatic about this modern vision that requires us to look at the world directly and sharply, and feeling somehow is Rembrandt's sentimental by Chuck Close's standards. And maybe there's something, a depth here that we don't always fully appreciate. Now, I think I've done it about right. I always leave 10 minutes for questions, and we have exactly 10 minutes left here. So can I help you with any questions? Yes?
Did he take his own photograph?
No, originally he might have. I couldn't tell you for sure. But the images I saw in the video were someone else photographing. Yeah. Yes. Here.
So, Rembrandt, I know we can't know this, but I'm just curious. Why do you think he did so many self-portraits? Yeah. And was he working from a mirror And if so, were mirrors as accurate as they are today?
I'm sure he had to have a mirror, and I think they were, in fact. Mirrors were much more expensive then, but remember, expense means nothing to Rembrandt. And by the way, they were done with mercury back then, and so making a mirror, people who made mirrors in Venice, for instance, they only lived short lives because they got blood poisoning from the mercury. I think we had a question in the back.
Yeah, I'm curious, if you're painting your picture and you're painting a self-portrait from a mirror, is the final work a mirror image of himself? Or does he correct that as he thinks?
You mean the reversal associated with the mirror?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I assume I've done self-portraits, and I don't even think about it. I just automatically shift left to right, right to left. Yeah, I assume, but it's a photographic image Chuck Close is working from, so I don't know if it would have that reversal. I don't know. I'm honestly not sure about it. You know, one of the things that sort of surprises people about artists, we're associated with high levels of creativity, and Rembrandt was probably one of the most creative of all artists of all time. But in order for that creativity to flourish, there needs to be a fixed structure on which you build that creativity, in which you impose that creativity on. So highly creative people are much more regimented in the way they behave than you would expect, because they don't want to waste time rethinking everything. They're focused on a particular issue that they want to emphasize in this particular work, and then they just trust the craft to solve, which solves all those other problems they don't want to be thinking about. When I carve, for instance, I use conventional tools. I think certain ways about space that are part of my background as a sculptor. But I'm working on a piece right now I'm calling Birth of an Angel, and it's a complex piece, and it's in walnut wood. And the only thing I'm thinking about is the way this piece opens up when you get to the top of it. I don't even think about which gouge am I using, what am I doing here or there. That stuff is just automatic. Rembrandt used that convention, yeah. There might have been symbolism on it, I don't know. Can I help you with any other questions? Yes?
You described Chuck Close as a printmaker, and then you say he's photorealism. Are those two words the same thing? Printmaker and photorealism, are they the same?
They blend together. That's a hard question to answer. This is why I like these question things, because people don't always, they wonder what I'm talking about. Basically, lithography is printing. So in that sense, you're a printmaker. I was a printmaker when I made church bulletins for my church on a lithography press. But at the same time, you're often working from a photo image. What I was doing was working from drawings that I had made myself. So you're both of those things at once. You're just reproducing what you've created, either with a camera or with your hand. Any other questions I can help you with? Yes, Gail. Oh, yeah, no, I think that's his characteristic signature. That's the signature I've seen all along. Each of us creates our own eccentric kind of signatures. Nowadays, with young people. I have a son-in-law who can't even read script, and looking at Leif's signature is, I can replicate Leif's signature simply because it's just a scroll. And we all do, and I assume you guys are encountering the same thing. My youthful signatures have much more coordination to them than the ones that I do now. Any other questions I can help you with? It's just about time. Again, I want to thank you all for coming. I remind you, we can meet here again next week on the 21st, and then we go to the 5th of December. Thank you again. And thank you, Emma.